Okay, welcome to Spatial webinar. My name is Ilkka Rinne. I'm the head of customer experience and interoperability at Spatial. And the topic for us today is the new INSPIRE Metadata Technical Guidance, which is in the final steps of being finalized. So. But before we actually go into that, I would like to say that this video of this webinar, as well as the slides, will be available after the webinar for you. So you don't have to go and get your pen and pencil out and your notebook. So you can get the slides later, and you can even share the webinar record with your colleagues if you want. And also at the end of the webinar today, so that is about in 50 minutes or so, we will have some time for questions and answers. And for that, I would ask you to use the chat functionality of the webinar software. If you have any questions, you can post them at any time during the webinar presentation here, and I'll try to get as many of them answered at the end of the webinar. So the first kind of reminder that this is what I'm going to talk about with you today is a preliminary version of the actual document. So it has not been endorsed by MIG-T at this point. However, the MIG-P hasn't endorsed it, so MIG-T has reviewed it and it's been completed. And as we speak, the final editing work is in progress by the JRC staff. And the expected timeline for the final document is that before, maybe even as we speak, the submission of the final edits, maybe next week, is expected to be submitted for MIG-P. And then there is this commenting period, obviously, and unless there are any big issues or blocking comments there, it should be finalized by the end of the year. And this means that now during this presentation, you have a possibility to kind of get a preview of what's there in the new document, the new guidance. But it also means that some of the details might still change during these final steps. So be aware of that. This presentation is based on the release candidate 4 version of the document. And unfortunately, as this is still in the editing works, this version is not yet has not yet been published by the JRC staff. So, but I think in a couple of days it will be posted in the wiki of MIG. That's my expectation. So if we go very quickly, I think most of you probably know what INSPIRE metadata is. So just briefly, it means that there are these formal machine-readable descriptions of INSPIRE spatial datasets and services to access those datasets and the interlinking between those services and the datasets. And the idea is that by using this metadata, that is a kind of formal way of description, enables the computer-aided data discovery and service discovery. So it helps to find the datasets and the services using a computer-aided systems. And the creation, maintenance, publishing of the metadata description is mandatory for the data providers and service providers by the INSPIRE regulations. And the actual metadata it itself follows the ISO 19115 data model for geographic information. And then there is another ISO standard with new revisions actually also, which describes the XML encoding for that metadata model. So there is an existing technical guidance for INSPIRE metadata. Why now this new version revision was made? So some of the issues identified by the EU member states were that the requirements for providing this metadata actually were included in different several separate documents before. So, for example, the elements for spatial data services were in another technical guidance document, and the elements for so-called interoperability, and also the data-specific, theme-specific elements were in the data specifications only. So the idea was to get all these requirements together in a single document. So it would be easier to actually find all the requirements for metadata. Also, there were some issues with the requirements considering the unique resource identifiers and coupled resources, which is the way to link back from the service metadata into datasets. And these requirements were not seen as clear enough in the old version. Also, similar issues with the describing the limitations on public access and conditions for access and use. Also, there were missing guidance or unclear guidance on using language-neutral identifiers, because the INSPIRE metadata sets can obviously be in many different languages within the EU countries. It still would be very useful to have a way of identifying things in a language-neutral way and use that, for example, in code list references. And also, the kind of overall idea was to improve the automatic metadata validation. So all the requirements in ideal world should be something that can be automatically tested by the validation tools. And so to get these things done, there was a MIG, which is the INSPIRE Maintenance and Implementation Group, subgroup number 8. It started working in autumn 2014 already. And first I'm going to go through the actual changes in the document. So how to read the new document, because has been somewhat kind of restructured to get all the new content in and make it more readable. So first of all, the kind of a bit of a technical issue. The old 3.1 version of the metadata technical guidance was a profile of the abstract ISO metadata model, and then there was a separate encoding, XML encoding rules in Annex A of that document. And now this new version is more XML oriented in a way that it's directly using requirement that all the metadata in INSPIRE must be encoded using these specific XML encodings. So that makes it slightly more clear what was already the expectations, that all the metadata should actually be provided using this XML encoding and not some other technical encoding of the metadata, of the abstract metadata model. And the reason for these changes is that everybody was using this anyway, and this kind of higher level of abstraction in these metadata requirements made it a bit difficult to formulate the requirements in a clear way. So now when all the requirements are based on the XML encoding, it's easier to say that these elements and these paths are actually required within the metadata record. So hopefully this change will also make it a bit easier for software developers to actually interpret the requirements of the metadata guidance to make better validation tools, make better editor tools, and so on for the INSPIRE metadata. Now, this is a one-slide reading guidance for the new document. So this is something that you might want to return when you take a first look on the actual document itself. So now the general structure is based on these 7 conformance classes, which each has a list of requirements that are specific to particular kind of resource that is being described. So, for example, in the chapter 3.1 contains conformance class 1, which is requirements for INSPIRE datasets and dataset series baseline metadata. And then on 3.2, there's an extension of that conformance class. So in addition to this baseline information, if you want to comply with the interoperability requirements of the datasets and dataset series, then you also have to take in consideration the requirements of the conformance class 2. And similarly, for spatial data services, the baseline metadata is in conformance class 3. That is the chapter 4.1. And then kind of more specialized requirements for network services and for the Invocable, Interoperable, and Harmonized spatial data services, and which are based on this implementation regulation, the INSPIRE regulation for invocable spatial data services. Those are kind of each extending the previous, so adding additional requirements considering the metadata for that kind of services. So hopefully this kind of new structure of the document is helpful in more quickly finding your scope, that what are the specific requirements that you need to provide for services and for the datasets. And some of the notable annexes also, in Annex C, there is this all a lot of these elements, metadata element tables that were included in the previous version within the actual requirement chapters. All of those tables have now been moved into Annex C. So you can still find those tables if you prefer that kind of information. Also, if you want to see what is the justification for each of these technical guidance requirements, you can look at the Annex E, which is a mapping table between the INSPIRE metadata elements, so those that are mentioned in the implementation rule, into the technical guidance requirements in this version 2. So you can find the mapping between those two in Annex E. And if you want to migrate from the previous version into this 2.0, the Annex F is probably very useful for you too, because that contains a mapping between the old requirements, their numbers, and the new requirement numbers. So within each of these conformance classes, there's still also a bit of reordering that has been done. So in the previous version, the elements were actually presented in the order of appearance in the implementation rule text. And to make this kind of XML structure orientation kind of coherent in the text, this 2.0 version lists all the requirements in the order of the actual metadata record in the XML schema. So each of the conformance classes start with the requirements for properties that are directly given as a non-object like properties of the MD metadata element, which is the root element for the metadata record. And then for the identification info section, distribution info section, and data quality info section, requirements are listed in that order, in each of them in a separate subsection of the conformance class chapter. So now when you look at the actual metadata record, it should be now easier to see which of the requirements apply to that particular section for that kind of resource to describe. So that is the reason why this reordering was made, and it hopefully makes it easier to find all the relevant parts that you might be missing. Yes, Cindy Mitchell just asked whether this link for this document is available. As I already mentioned in the very beginning, unfortunately, this version, release candidate 4 version or 5 version is still in the final editing process by the Joint Research Center. So I can't I can't publish it right now, but hopefully it'll be available very soon in the next few weeks. And I will post you an email kind of email message when that happens, so you'll get the first look. So if you look at the actual requirement text more closely, what has been changed text? So in the old version looks like this, that you have this title for the requirement, and then you have a short description of the element, and then you have this table which contains certain kind of aspects, different kind of aspects for that particular element, like the XPath XML structure, and also conditions, whether that is mandatory by the INSPIRE requirements or conditional, and what's the multiplicity, and so on. And then there is this actual requirement box, which is the mandatory part that captures a requirement, and that those things are given separately. And it might, if you don't really know how to read this, it could be a question whether this table is actually part of the requirement or not. So if the same things are not mentioned in this requirement box, is it mandatory to still follow this this table or not. So this was one of the things that hopefully is now more clear in the new structure for the same elements, so resource locator for services. Now there is always a quote from the implementation rule that is kind of a justification for this particular requirement. So you can see how the kind of the abstract requirement from the implementation rule, which is a legal requirement, maps into this particular technical implementation using the XML metadata encoding. And then the actual requirement text now contains a unique URI, which is a reference that can be used for referring from outside into this particular requirement. And then there is usually a complete XPath requirement, XPath expression that says that what is the actual required XML element and within the whole XML metadata record structure. So this is now more specific, more XML oriented in this requirement. And also the multiplicity that was previously in the table is now included in the actual requirement box. So I already mentioned that each of the technical requirements have now a URI to refer to. Same thing applies to each of the conformance class also. So that hopefully makes it easier to use these kind of identifiers from external documents, validation tools, and so on to point exactly to these particle conformance classes and requirements. And similar kind of improved referencing is now used, for example, for code lists where the XML ISO XML encoding requires in many places a free text description, but that has been kind of added as a requirement or a recommendation, depending on element, to use a code list value instead of this free text description. And those code lists are then INSPIRE specific and not the ISO code list. So for example, in this example, these limitations on public access in the gray box there is a reference to this particular INSPIRE code list value that has been used in the anchor element within the GMX namespace. And because that element extends the free text or the character string element type, you can use it instead of the actual free text description. And this mechanism has been done has been used in the new guidance quite a lot to refer to INSPIRE code lists. Now, going more kind of in the details, in more technical issues about the changes in the actual requirements for INSPIRE metadata that has been made in this new version. So these changes are based on not on the editing process, which I was contracted for in last spring, but rather the whole work of the INSPIRE metadata technical subgroup, so the group 8. So maybe one of the more kind of interesting changes in the metadata that the metadata providers now need to take into consideration is how to uniquely identify these resources, so data sets especially. And in the previous version, there was a requirement that if this unique identifier for dataset consists of both a kind of code namespace and then the code value, you should use the ARAS identifier element instead of the kind of default MD identifier, which only has the code element available. And now, at least in the release candidate 4 version, it's now required that because the identifier should now be an URI, and it would kind of, the current version requires that this URI is always given using the MD identifier and sub-element code. So the whole URI is in the same metadata element now, including the namespace and the actual code. And because this code is, again, a free text or character string type element, you can either use the GMX anchor, as mentioned before, to actually refer using the exact URL and then a free text part, or you can use just a character string to give that URI element. As this is obviously could be a big change for those metadata providers who have been using the ARAS identifier, this is still a bit open whether that requirement stays in the final document. But we will see in the next days or next few weeks how it goes. So it's still a bit open, but yeah. So it's worth checking out how this turns out in the end. Related to these unique resource identifiers, there is also kind of more kind of clarification on how to point from the service metadata descriptions to the data set descriptions, and that's called coupled resource. And this was not very, very exact in the previous version of the technical guidance. Actually, the requirement box only stated that this particular property should be implemented as a reference. And now, in the new version, it is more explicit that this reference should always be a URI that points to the MD data identification element of the referred dataset. And this is actually a requirement that comes from the ISO model that this operates on element should always point to the data identification element of the dataset. And how this works in practice is that there can be several mechanisms for actually kind of, for example, you could use a CSW request for pointing to the whole metadata record, and then use this kind of URL hash fragment mechanism to actually point to the specific element within that metadata document. Or you can have some kind of URL resolver that actually resolves this unique resource identifier, for example, into this kind of metadata get record request. So couple of examples on how to do that are now also included in the new metadata technical guidance. But the requirement just says that whatever you use for actually implementing that kind of reference, it must be a URI, and it must resolve. It must somehow point to this data identification element. Somehow going forward with the essential changes in the metadata requirements, about the limitation in public access. Previous version 3.1 included 3 options, optional ways to actually give these limitations. So either the access constraints or other constraints within the legal constraints element, or the classification element under the security constraints element. So any of these, or at least one of these, was or still is a required in the metadata if you follow the 3.1 technical guidance. And now in the new version 2.0, it's always the legal constraints element, and this goes even within that. You will have to use both the access constraints element with the other restrictions code, and then the actual limitation goes to the other constraints element that that must contain this GMX anchor element pointing to the INSPIRE code list for this particular purpose. So now it is more exact that you shall always use this legal constraints element with these 2 child elements within that. So there's less room for making different kind of expressions for that in the new version. A bit similar thing about the conditions applying to access and use. This previous version says that the use limitation elements must be used for describing these conditions for applying to access and use, which could be, for example, license terms and fees for these resources. And for the reasons that I'm going to go in the next slide, this is now changed, that you should use also for this element, for this data, use the legal constraints element, but a slightly different combination of elements there. You can either use the access constraints or the use constraints element within the legal constraints. And regardless on which one you choose, the value is the ISO code list value other restrictions. And in addition to either one of these, there's the actual reason, the actual fees, the actual licensing terms should be included in the other constraints element. And this applies to, even if there are no special licensing terms, there are no special fees, these elements should be there, and you shall then add the use the no conditions apply or conditions unknown code list values from the INSPIRE code list in there. If there are some known conditions, then this same element, so the other constraints element, is used for actual describing these conditions that apply to the access and use of these resources. So this is a bit, it can be a bit difficult to understand without looking at the actual XML examples, and these examples are now included in the metadata document, so hopefully it is easier to see what is actually required using the examples here. But if you know your INSPIRE metadata, ISO metadata model, then probably you can also find that out yourself. And the reason why the use limitation is no longer considered for this is that the actual intention of these use limitation elements is more like is more about the applicability of the data or the metadata for a particular use purpose. So, for example, you could use this element for describing that this particular weather forecast information is not to be used for aviation forecasting, for example. So this is what the actual element should be used for, and when it was required to be used also for the licensing and fees information, it was slightly confusing because depending on the metadata provider, some use it for different purpose than others, and now this change has been made to clarify this situation. I already briefly mentioned the code list references. There's also a small clarification considering the ISO 19139 code list values, which is the standard for the XML encoding of the ISO metadata. Now it is explicitly said that only the code list value element of this attribute of this particular code list elements is used for, it's kind of formative, and both the code list attribute, which usually contains a name or the URL address where you can find this particular code list, that is considered informative only now, as well as the textual content of this element. So if you are any of the validators which are validating this metadata according to this 2.0 technical guidance, should take both the code list attribute and the textual content of this code list value elements as informative and not complain that they don't have any particular reference to a URL that contains this code list, for example. And the reason for this is that according to the ISO metadata standard, these code lists are actually fixed. So this mechanism for providing the URL cannot be used for extending the code list, for example, not just changing the code list attribute. And there was a lot of confusion whether this code list should point to one version of this code list available online or some other, or whether it made any difference whether it points anywhere. And now it is more clear that this is informative. This can be useful. I would recommend to use something that actually results into a description of this code list, but it's not strictly required. I already mentioned briefly the language neutral identifiers issue. Now this is used in several places, this GMX anchor mechanism for actually pointing to a particular INSPIRE code list values within the INSPIRE registry. So this is a way to actually include something that is a machine readable code list reference, but also provide a human readable description of that within the same element. So this now appears in many of the requirements and recommendation within the new technical guidance. Now going to the spatial data services requirements. So this is something that was usually before that was given in another technical guidance for INSPIRE Spatial Data Services. So all the metadata requirements from that technical guidance has now been moved into the same metadata technical guidance for INSPIRE. So as you probably know, the spatial data services have been can be classified as the ones that are regulated by the network services implementation rule in the INSPIRE, and then the ones that are regulated by the implementation rule for interoperability. And these are the latter ones are the ones that I'm going to talk about now. They have some specific requirements for the metadata. And I'm just listing the most important changes for that from the previous version, which is included in the technical guidance for spatial data services. So in that version, there were these INSPIRE specific extensions for both of the provided XML schema for the metadata, and also for some of these code lists for the spatial data service access point, for example. And now in the new version, the metadata XML schema is not extended anymore, so there are no INSPIRE specific elements. Rather, the existing document ISO elements, domain consistency and conceptual consistency that are within the data quality section are now used for expressing these both the spatial data set category and the declared quality of service criteria for the services. So this is now kind of easier in a way that the XML schemas don't have to be extended for INSPIRE use. Also, the access point for a spatial data service is now described a bit in a different way. So it's not using the function element as in the previous version, but it's using the description element within the transfer options element. So now the function is given as intended by the ISO model, and you don't have to change that, but you can actually describe that this is a INSPIRE spatial dataset service access point using the description element. Now, because this is going to change some of the things, so it required for some of the metadata providers, it probably means some work to make these records, metadata records, compliant with these new requirements. And for this reason, it is proposed in the technical guidance currently that there is this transition period of 3 years. And during that 3 years, both versions will be considered compliant with the INSPIRE technical guidelines. And how long that 3 years is actually going to take really depends on decisions of the MIG, obviously. So, but because we have this timeline at least probably for the end of the year, so it's expected that you will most likely have time until 2019 to make these changes, so it's compliant with the new technical guidance. And in practice, this means that the INSPIRE validator, the ones that is provided by in the GeoPortal, will be validating the metadata against both versions the requirements. And you will get results from both validations. And then there is this compliance meter or gauge that actually gives an overview of how compliant you are within the from 0 to 100%. It is using the better one. So if you still have the if you still have the old version, so 1.3 metadata, and during that 3 years, it's fine. It still can be 100% INSPIRE compliant when considering the technical guidance requirements. And even just after that, at any point that is convenient for you, you can make the changes, and you don't have to change all the metadata record, for example, in one go, but you can gradually change the metadata contents to match the new requirements. And I think it's a reasonable assumption that the actual conformance classes and the executable test suite, so the ways to actually validate these new requirements, will be added in both the GeoPortal validator and also in the new upcoming INSPIRE test framework tools. And unfortunately, I don't have a clear timeline when that's going to happen. So you probably want to ask your MIG-T representative about that, how that's going to progress. But I've seen the new INSPIRE test framework demo, and it looks very promising, though. So I think that's going well forward. Now, obviously, we in the editing work and in the actual group work, there were some issues that we didn't have time to cover in this new version. For example, the actual writing of the abstract test suites is still in work in progress, and those rules will be included in the GitHub repository directly. So it's I think it's more reasonable to have those included in a different in the place where they can be directly referred using a URL reference, and that's also usable for making the validation tools. But those requirements for this new version, the changes that were made here, are not ready yet, so that's still work in progress. Also, the new guidelines is not 100% clear on the issue of community extensions of INSPIRE metadata. So it's not like it's forbidden to extend the XML schemas used, but for example, the requirements contain the full XPath expressions for those elements. So it's not very extension friendly at the moment, because when you extend this schema, you would have to give a new name or new namespace at least for that extended element, and then it no longer matches exactly this XPath expression. So that is still something that would probably need to be clarified in the future version of the technical guidance to make that extension extending easier, and to make it also kind of more coherent, to give instruction on how that should be done, so that the interoperability stays good within the INSPIRE. And also, Some of you might know that there is a new version of this ISO metadata standard, which was published in 2014 already, and the XML mapping for that this year. And that also contains references to this other metadata or the ISO description on the quality issues. And this new version was deliberately not included in this technical guidance. So this is still based on the old metadata ISO standard, old version, and also the XML encoding the old XML schemas. So it was considered probably too much work to actually do that in this version. So this will most likely happen at some point in the future, of course, because the new ISO standard is already approved. So there will probably be increasing pressure from a lot of communities to actually make that change. But it remains to be seen what in what phase this is. This is a good way to actually move into this new version in the INSPIRE metadata. Then probably you want more information about this. As I already mentioned, I'm going to send all the registered participants of this webinar an email once I know that the new technical guidance document is available. But you can also, you probably want to consult your national contact point. If you don't know who that is, you can find this the contact information within using this new INSPIRE website. If you want to look at the MICT meeting agendas and minutes, those are also publicly available in the MIC wiki site. And something that I would recommend you to take a look at is the what's new listing or feature of the INSPIRE GeoPortal validator that contains all the latest additions in that validator software. And that's it's a good place to actually see when particular changes have been made and what has been changed in the validator. And if you want to look at the abstract test suites and also related testing modules, then there is a GitHub website which contains several of these repositories, one for each of the conformance classes. So that contains ATSs for network services, but also for metadata, and that will eventually also include this new technical guidance 2.0 compliant abstract test suite descriptions. So now we still have a couple of minutes. If you have some questions that I might be able to answer, I will at least try to do that. And if I can't do it myself, I will forward your question to the metadata subgroup. Okay, I'm reading a question or a comment from Tim Duffy. Yeah, so it's about the XML schemas. The Tim's question is where will the actual XML schemas for the metadata be hosted, and that is not within this metadata technical guidance. It's currently using links which are pointing to the ISO website for the actual metadata, the base metadata schema, and to the OGC schema repository for the service metadata part. But as you mentioned in the comment, and I think there is this at least some kind of recommendation on publishing just one, having kind of INSPIRE specific hosting place for this combined schema that contains both the ISO schema, XML schema description, and the service metadata that is provided by OGC. And also that would include something like additional parts like the GMX namespace. And I know that this has at least been tried. So I know that Michael Lutz from JRC has been trying this out, but I'm not. But I hope that this will happen, so that there will be a one place to use for referring to these XML schemas, because it's always confusing when you're not sure whether you should use a reference from one particular site or another, or whether that will go away at some point when they change the document structure also. So yeah, I hope that will be resolved, and those new schema locations will be added in the final version of the document. Are there any other questions? If no other questions, then I would like to thank you very much for your attention. And as said, you will get a email with the links to both to the webinar video and the slides presented here today. So thank you very much, and good continuation for your week, and have a nice evening or morning, depending on which side of the Atlantic you are at. So thank you, and bye-bye.